quiet spaces where nothing much happens at all. And that's exactly how it should be. There's no rush here, no excitement, no surprises, just the calm, steady life of a man named Mr. Everett, who takes care of this endless library with careful attention and gentle hands. His days are slow, his routines are simple, and the library is always quiet. So find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and close your eyes if you like. I'm going to take you through Mr. Everett's week, one day at a time. And tonight, we begin with Monday, the dusting of shelves. Chapter 1, the endless routine. Monday, the dusting of shelves. The morning light spilled through the tall, arched windows of the endless bookshelf, stretching in long, slow patterns across the wooden floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of sunlight, drifting up and down as if they were in no hurry to land. Everything was quiet and still, just as it always was. Mr. Everett stepped inside, the heavy oak door creaking softly behind him. He paused, just like he did every Monday morning, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old books and polished wood, with just the faintest hint of rain, even though the sky outside was clear and bright. It was a smell he had known for as long as he could remember. Slowly, with calm and steady movements, he walked to his desk. His shoes made soft tapping sounds on the polished floor, and the sound echoed gently before fading back into silence. His desk was simple, made of dark wood, with just a single green-shaded lamp, a stack of parchment, and a feather duster that hung neatly on a brass hook. He reached for the feather duster, running his fingers over the soft plumes. It was made of goose feathers, tied carefully to a smooth wooden handle. It was light and soft, perfect for brushing away dust without disturbing the books. He lifted it gently, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and turned towards the east wing. The east wing was where he always began. The sunlight was brightest there in the mornings, spilling through the high windows and casting long, soft shadows over the rows of bookshelves. The shelves were tall, so tall that they seemed to stretch up and up, disappearing into the shadows above. They were made of dark mahogany, polished to a soft shine. Each row held hundreds of books, their spines lined up neatly, some with gilded titles, others worn and faded. Mr. Everett started with the first shelf, as he always did. He reached up, the feather duster gliding over the tops of the books. It moved in smooth, even strokes, brushing away the fine layer of dust that had settled there over the week. The dust rose in small clouds, swirling in the sunlight before drifting back down, lighter and softer than before. He moved slowly, without any hurry at all. There was no need to rush. The books had been there for as long as he could remember, and they would be there long after he was done. His hand moved back and forth, the feathers brushing gently over the covers. He would pause, sometimes to in gold, shining softly in the light. Others were written in faded ink, the words barely visible. But it didn't matter. He dusted them all the same. When he finished the first row, he stepped back, looked it over carefully, and gave a small nod. Then, just as slowly, he moved to the next. The ladder was waiting for him, leaning against the edge of the shelf. It was tall and made of smooth wood, polished by years of use. Mr. Everett set the duster down for a moment, running his hands along the rungs. The wood was cool and solid beneath his fingertips. He placed one hand on the ladder, then one foot, then another. Step by step he climbed, the wood creaking just a little as he rose. It was a comforting sound, like the library was breathing along with him. When he reached the top, he paused, looking out over the tops of the shelves. From up there, he could see the rows stretching on and on, disappearing into the distance. It was quiet and still. He reached out with the duster, brushing the tops of the books gently. Dust lifted and floated away, catching the light before drifting back down again. His hand moved in the same smooth rhythm, back and forth, covering each book evenly. He paused at the end of the row, wiped his hands on a cloth he kept in his pocket, and climbed back down. Once his feet touched the ground again, he picked up the ladder and moved it 5 steps to the right. It always took 5 steps, not 4, not 6, just 5. He leaned it against the shelf, patted it gently as if it were an old friend, and climbed back up to continue his work. The morning passed like that, quiet and steady. The sunlight drifted slowly across the floor, stretching out and then pulling back as the hours moved on. Mr. Everett climbed and dusted, until every shelf in the east wing had been brushed clean. He never rushed, never hurried. There was always enough time. When the last shelf was finished, Mr. Everett stepped back, took a slow, deep breath, and admired his work. The books looked clean and cared for, their spines gleaming softly in the light. He gave a small nod of satisfaction and wiped his hands again, tucking the cloth back into his pocket. He walked back to his desk, hung the feather duster back on its brass hook, and sat down. His chair creaked a little as he settled in. He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot that had been warming by the window. The steam curled up lazily, drifting into the stillness of the room. He took a slow sip, set the cup down, and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes just for a moment. The library was quiet, just as it always was. The dust had settled. The sunlight stretched across the floor, and everything felt just right. Tuesday. The reorganization of periodicals Tuesday mornings began just like every other morning at the endless bookshelf. Soft sunlight crept through the tall, arched windows, casting long beams of light across the polished wooden floor. Dust, motes floated in the sunlight, drifting slowly up and down, catching the light before settling back down again. turned the key with a quiet click. The hinges creaked softly, the sound carrying through the stillness before fading back into silence. He paused for a moment just inside the entrance and took a deep breath. The air smelled like paper and polished wood, with just the faintest hint of old leather. It was a comforting smell, familiar and steady, like everything else in the library. Today was Tuesday, and that meant it was time for the reorganisation of periodicals. Mr. Everett walked calmly to the far side of the library, where tall wooden shelves held rows and rows of periodicals, magazines, journals, newsletters, and pamphlets, all neatly stacked and carefully preserved. The shelves stretched up to the ceiling, just like the bookshelves, but they were divided into smaller sections, each one labelled with a brass plaque. He stepped up to the first section, brushing his hand along the edge of the shelf to check for dust. There was none, of course. Monday's work had taken care of that. He gave a small nod of satisfaction, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a soft white cloth. He unfolded it carefully, laying it out on the long wooden table that stood in the centre of the room. It was the same table he used every Tuesday, polished to a soft shine, with no scratches or dents. Mr. Everett began with the top row of the first shelf. His hands moved slowly, gently lifting the first stack of periodicals and placing them on the cloth. He ran his hand over the edges, smoothing out the corners, pressing the spines so that they were perfectly aligned. He did this for each bundle, one at a time, moving from left to right, just as he always did. When the shelf was empty, he picked up the first stack and carried it back to the table. The magazines were old, some very old, with yellowed pages and curled edges. Their covers were faded, the pictures softened by time. He ran his fingers over the dates printed in small, neat lettering on the top corner. He read each one out loud, his voice a soft whisper in the stillness. March 1924, he murmured, straightening the corners. July 1931. November 1958. The stack was organised by year, then by month, then by volume. He did this slowly, taking each periodical in his hands, smoothing out the pages, checking for stray bits of dust or small wrinkles. If he found a folded corner, he would press it gently back into place. If there was a smudge on the cover, he would wipe it with the edge of his cloth, rubbing softly until it was clean. When the first stack was perfectly organised, he moved on to the next. His hands were steady and careful, moving with the same smooth rhythm he used for dusting the shelves. The magazines were light and thin, sliding easily under his touch. He placed them back on the table, one by one, until they were all lined up neatly. The morning sunlight moved slowly across the room as he worked, stretching out across the floor and inching its way up the walls. Dust motes still floated in the purr, light swirling gently whenever he passed by, only to settle again once he moved Outside, the branches of tall, leafy trees swayed just slightly in the breeze, their shadows flickering across the windows. When the first shelf was finished, Mr. Everett would pause, take a slow breath, and look over his work. The periodicals were stacked perfectly, no edges out of line, no pages bent or crumpled. He nodded once, satisfied, and then turned back to the shelf. He reached for the next stack, lifting it carefully and placing it on the cloth. His movements were smooth and practiced, the same every week. He would straighten the corners, check the spines, and read the dates aloud, just as he had with the first stack. April 1962, August 1975, February 1988. The sound of his voice was soft, blending with the silence of the library. He liked the way the words sounded, the way the years felt familiar on his tongue. He placed each one back on the shelf when he was done, running his hand along the spines to make sure they were perfectly even. Mr. Everett continued like this for hours, moving slowly from one shelf to the next. He never rushed, never hurried. There was always enough time to make sure everything was just right. His movements were steady and deliberate, his hands never shaking or faltering. Outside, the sunlight shifted, stretching farther across the room, then shrinking back again. As the afternoon crept in, when he finished the last shelf, he stepped back, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it back on his desk. He ran his hand along the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath his fingertips. He gave one last nod of approval, then turned and walked back to his desk. His chair creaked as he sat down, the leather cushions sighing under his weight. He poured himself a cup of tea, just as he always did, and watched the dust settle back onto the shelves in the soft glow of the afternoon light. Everything was in its place. Everything was just right. Wednesday, the polishing of tables. Wednesday mornings at the endless bookshelf always began the same way. Soft light would trickle in through the tall, arched windows, spilling across the wooden floors and stretching out in long, gentle patterns. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight, rising and falling slowly, like tiny stars floating through the still water. The library was quiet, calm, and perfectly still. Mr. Everett stepped inside, right on time. His shoes made the same soft tapping sounds as he walked across the polished floors, his footsteps even and unhurried. He paused at the great oak doors and turned the key, hearing the familiar click as the lock settled into place. The hinges creaked softly, the sound spreading out through the silence before fading away. He stood for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just a faint hint of beeswax and leather. Wednesday was always polishing day. Mr. Everett walked calmly to his desk in the centre of the library, his movements slow and measured. The desk was simple and well kept, with a green shaded lamp a stack of neatly ordered parchment, and a small wooden box where he kept his supplies. He opened the box carefully, reaching inside to take out his polishing cloth and a small tin of beeswax. The tin was round and smooth, with a little metal clasp that made a soft click when he opened it. Inside, the wax was golden and firm, smelling faintly of honey and sunshine. He set the tin on the desk, unfolded the cloth, and placed it neatly beside it. His hands moved carefully, not rushing. He dipped 2 fingers into the wax, scooping out just enough to cover the tips. It was smooth and slightly cool to the touch. He rubbed his fingers together, spreading the wax evenly before pressing it gently into the cloth. He folded the edges over, rubbing it back and forth until the cloth was ready. The tables were scattered throughout the library, placed in quiet corners and along sunlit paths between the shelves. Each one was made of dark wood, polished smooth. Over the years, their surfaces clear and empty, waiting for the touch of his cloth. Mr. Everett walked slowly to the first one, his shoes whispering against the floor, his movements calm and steady. He set the cloth down on the tabletop and began to move it in slow, steady circles. His hand pressed gently, guiding the cloth in perfect, even motions, around and around, never too fast, never too slow. The wax spread out in a thin, shiny layer, catching the light and reflecting it back in soft glows. He moved his hand back and forth, covering every inch of the surface. The room was silent except for the soft, rhythmic sound of the cloth gliding over the wood. Mr. Everett worked with the same calm attention that he used for dusting the shelves and organising the periodicals. There was no rush. There was never any rush. Each motion was part of the routine, part of the gentle rhythm of his week. When the first table was done, he stepped back, looking it over carefully. The surface gleamed in the sunlight, smooth and clean, polished to a perfect shine. He nodded once, satisfied, then moved on to the next table. He dipped his fingers back into the wax, spreading it onto the cloth, folding it carefully and pressing it back down onto the wood. His hand moved in slow, even circles, never faltering, never missing a spot. He polished the edges, then the dry corners, then the smooth, flat surface in the middle. He wiped away any excess, making sure it was perfect before stepping back to admire his work. The morning light shifted slowly as he worked, stretching out and pulling back as the hours drifted by. Dust motes continued to float through the sunlight, spiralling up when he passed by and settling back down when he moved on. Outside, the branches of tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows flickering across the windows in slow, soft patterns. Mr. Everett moved from table to table, polishing each one with the same calm attention. His hand moved in circles, steady and even, the soft scent of pause every now and then to stretch his back, smoothing out his coat before leaning back over the wood to continue his slow, steady work. When he reached the last table, he dipped his fingers into the wax one final time, spreading it onto the cloth with gentle strokes. He placed the cloth back onto the wood, moving it in the same slow circles, his hand pressing down just enough to bring out the shine. He polished the edges carefully, making sure each curve and corner was smooth and bright. Finally, he stepped back, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it back into its wooden box. He closed the lid with a soft click and returned it to his desk, setting it down just as he always did, lined up perfectly with the edge, its corners square and even. He gave a small nod of approval, then turned back to look at the tables. They shone in the sunlight, their surfaces smooth and clean, reflecting the light in long, gentle streaks. Everything was in its place. Everything was just right. Mr. Everett poured himself a cup of tea, just as he did every Wednesday afternoon. He sat at his desk, cradling the warm cup in his hands, his eyes drifting over the polished tables, the soft sunlight, the floating dust motes. He took a slow sip, closed his eyes, and breathed in the stillness. The library was quiet, the tables were clean, and everything was exactly as it should be. Thursday, the cataloguing of new books. Thursday mornings always began with a soft, golden light spilling through the tall windows of the endless bookshelf. The sunlight crept along the wooden floors, stretching across the polished surfaces and warming the shadows that lingered in the corners. Dust motes floated in slow spirals, drifting up and down, catching the light before settling gently back down again. The library was quiet and calm, just as it always was. Mr. Everett arrived right on time. He stepped inside, turning the heavy brass key in the oak door with a soft click. The door creaked open, the sound echoing quietly before fading back into the stillness. He paused just inside the entrance, taking a slow, deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just a hint of rain, even though the sky outside was clear and blue. Today was Thursday, and that meant it was time for the cataloguing of new books. It was a job Mr. Everett always approached with great care. He walked slowly to the centre of the library, his shoes tapping gently against the wooden floor. His desk was waiting for him, just as it always was, polished and simple, with a green-shaded lamp, a stack of neatly arranged parchment, and an ink pot with a silver-tipped pen. But Thursday mornings also brought something special. Near the front door, just beside the tall coat rack, there would always be a small wooden crate. It was sturdy and well made, bound with thick rope and predictably seal. Mr. Everett never questioned where the crate came from. It was simply there every Thursday, waiting patiently to be opened. He walked over to the crate, knelt down slowly, and ran his hands along its edges. The wood was cool and smooth under his fingertips. The rope tied in a careful knot that was always easy to undo. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small penknife, the blade polished and sharp, though it had never seen much use. With gentle hands, he slid the blade under the knot, tugging it free with soft, steady movements. The rope loosened easily, coiling into neat loops as he unwound it. He set it aside, folding it carefully before placing it back on top of the crate. Then just as slowly he lifted the lid. It opened with a quiet creak, the hinges groaning softly before settling back into silence. Inside, wrapped in thick brown paper, were the new books. Mr. Everett always took his time unwrapping each one. His hands were steady and gentle, peeling back the paper with slow, careful movements. The paper crackled softly, unfolding in thin, even layers until the book inside was revealed. He would pause, just for a moment, to admire the cover. Sometimes leather bound, sometimes cloth, always pristine and untouched. The titles were printed neatly across the spines, some in gold leaf, some in silver, and some in plain black ink. He would read each one aloud, his voice soft and steady, blending with the stillness of the library. The Garden of Falling Leaves, A Study of Midnight Rain, The Collected Tales of Whispering Pines. The books were always beautiful, always perfect. He would turn them over in his hands, feeling the weight of the pages, running his fingers along the edges. If there was dust, he would brush it away with the edge of his sleeve. If there was a folded corner, he would smooth it out gently, making sure everything was just right. When each book was unwrapped and inspected, he would set it gently on the table, aligning the spines so that they were perfectly straight. He did this for each book, one by one, until the crate was empty and the table was filled with neat stacks, all arranged by size and colour. He would step back, looking them over, nodding slightly in approval. Then came the cataloguing. Mr. Everett would take out a thick leather-bound ledger from the drawer of his desk. Its pages were smooth and heavy, filled with neat lines of handwritten titles, dates, and locations. He opened it to the next blank page, uncapped his pen, and dipped it slowly into the inkpot. His handwriting was steady and clean, the letters perfectly formed. He wrote each title with careful attention, pausing between each word to make sure it was clear and readable. Next to each title, he would write the date, his pen moving smoothly across the paper. When he was done, he would blow gently across the ink to help it dry, then close the ledger and set it back in its drawer. One by one, he carried the books to their proper places. His footsteps were soft and measured, the only sound in the quiet library. He knew exactly where each one belonged. Some were placed high up on the shelves in the western wing, while others fit snugly into the lower rows of the eastern wing. He would slide them into place with slow, deliberate movements, running his hand along the spine to make sure it was even with the others. The sunlight drifted across the room as he worked, stretching long and thin before retreating back into the corners. Dust motes continued to float lazily in the beams of light, settling and rising with each step he took. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows flickering across the windows. When the last book was placed on the shelf, Everett stepped back, wiped his hands on a cloth he kept in his pocket, and admired his work. Everything was in its place. Everything was just right. He walked back to his desk, folded the brown wrapping paper neatly, and placed it back in the crate. He closed the lid with a soft click, coiled the rope back on top, and pushed the crate back to its spot beside the coat rack. Finally, he sat down, poured himself a cup of tea, and leaned back in his chair. The library was silent, the books were catalogued, and everything was exactly as it should be. Friday, the washing of windows. Friday mornings always began the same way at the endless bookshelf. Soft light filtered through the tall, arched windows, stretching across the wooden floor and casting long, gentle shadows. Dust motes floated slowly in the sunlight, drifting up and down like tiny stars suspended in the air. Everything was still and calm. The library was quiet, just as it always was. Mr. Everett arrived right on time, just as he did every morning. His shoes made soft tapping sounds on the polished wood as he walked to the heavy oak doors. He turned the brass key with a soft click, and the doors creaked open, the sound echoing quietly before fading back into the stillness. He stepped inside, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just a hint of rain, even though the sky outside was clear and bright. Today was Friday, and that meant it was time for the washing of windows. Mr. Everett walked slowly to the small wooden closet just behind his desk. He opened the door carefully, the hinges sighing softly as he pulled it wide. Inside, everything was neatly arranged. There was a bucket made of smooth, polished metal, and beside it, a bundle of soft white cloths, folded perfectly and stacked in even piles. There was also a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid that caught the light and shimmered faintly. He took out the bucket first, holding it by the handle and setting it gently on the floor. Then he reached for the cloths, taking just 2 from the top of the pile. He smoothed them out with his hands, making sure there were no wrinkles, before placing them neatly inside the bucket. Finally, he picked up the glass bottle, holding it up to the light for a moment to watch the liquid by its handle and carried it across the room, his footsteps soft and measured. The windows stretched high along the walls of the library, tall and arched, reaching up to meet the shadows that lingered near the ceiling. They were made of thick, clear glass, perfectly smooth and polished, though they collected a thin layer of dust by the end of each week. He started with the first window on the eastern side, where the sunlight poured in the brightest during the morning hours. He set the bucket down carefully on the floor, unwrapped one of the cloths, and held it up to the light. It was soft and white, perfectly clean, just as it always was. He folded it neatly, dipping one corner into the bucket, and then poured just a little of the clear liquid onto it, watching it soak in slowly. Mr. Everett stepped up to the window, raised the cloth, and began to clean in slow, steady circles. His hand moved evenly, pressing just enough to spread the liquid in smooth, thin lines across the glass. The dust lifted easily, wiped away with each pass of the cloth, leaving behind clear, shining glass that caught the sunlight and sparkled just a little. He moved his hand back and forth, in the same calm rhythm. The cloth made soft, whispering sounds against the glass, blending with the quiet of the library. He started at the top of the window, reaching up as far as he could, and slowly worked his way down. He wiped the edges carefully, making sure to catch any dust that had settled in the corners, then moved back to the centre, polishing it until it gleamed. When he finished the first window, he stepped back and looked it over. The sunlight poured through, clear and bright, without a single smudge or streak. He nodded once, folded the cloth neatly, and dipped it back into the bucket. Then he moved 5 steps to the right, always 5 steps, and set the bucket down in front of the next window. He unfolded the cloth again, poured just a little more of the clear liquid onto it, and began the same slow, steady motions, back and forth, back and forth. His hand never rushed, never hurried. The dust lifted away, and the glass shone in the sunlight, clean and perfect. The morning light shifted slowly as he worked, stretching out across the floor and climbing the walls before settling back down again. Outside, the branches of tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows flickering across the windows in soft, steady patterns. Dust motes continued to float lazily in the air, catching the sunlight and drifting back down when he moved on. Mr. Everett polished each window with the same calm attention. He wiped the edges, smoothed out the glass, and stepped back to admire his work before moving on. One window at a time, always 5 steps to the right, always dipping the cloth back into the bucket, always pouring just a little more liquid onto it before beginning again. When he reached the last window, he wiped the glass in slow, even strokes, his hand never faltering. He stepped back, looked it over, and gave a small nod of approval, sunlight streamed through, casting long beams of light across the room, perfectly clear and bright. Everything was just as it should be. Mr. Everett folded the cloth neatly, set it back into the bucket, and carried it back to the closet. He placed the cloths back on the shelf, the bottle beside them, and the bucket on the floor. He closed the door gently, hearing the soft click as it shut. He walked back to his desk, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat down, watching the sunlight stream through the windows. The library was silent, the windows were clean, and everything was just right. Saturday, the arranging of tables, chairs. Saturday mornings at the endless bookshelf always began with the soft glow of sunlight spilling through the tall, arched windows. The light stretched out across the polished wooden floors, casting long shadows that moved ever so slowly as the sun rose higher in the sky. Dust motes floated gently in the light, swirling up and down, drifting with no hurry at all. The library was quiet and still, just as it always was. Mr. Everett arrived right on time, just as he did every morning. His shoes made soft tapping sounds as he walked across the wooden floor to the large oak doors. He turned the brass key with a soft click, and the door creaked open, the sound spreading out through the library before fading back into silence. He stepped inside, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just a hint of beeswax from the tables he had polished earlier in the week. Today was Saturday, and that meant it was time for the arranging of tables and chairs. It was a quiet task, one that Mr. Everett always enjoyed. He walked calmly to the centre of the library, his footsteps soft and measured, his hands folded neatly behind his back. He stood there for a moment, looking out over the rows of tables and chairs that filled the open spaces between the towering shelves. The tables were made of dark mahogany, their surfaces smooth and polished. The chairs were wooden as well, with high backs and sturdy legs, each one placed neatly around the tables. But by the end of the week, some would shift just a little, moved slightly out of place by the rare visitors who wandered through the library. Mr. Everett always started at the far corner of the east wing. There was a large round table there, surrounded by 4 chairs. He stepped up to it, his hands smoothing over the wood, feeling the gentle grain beneath his fingertips. He placed his hand on the back of the first chair and moved it just an inch to the left. It made a soft scraping sound as it slid across the floor, then settled back into place. He moved to the next chair, adjusting it the same way, just an inch to the left, then the next, and the next, until all 4 were perfectly aligned, evenly spaced around the table. He took a step back, looked it over, and nodded slowly. Everything was just right. Mr. Everett walked calmly to the next table, footsteps soft and even. This one was rectangular, with 6 chairs, 3 on each side. He stepped up to the first chair, placing his hand on the backrest, and moved it just a bit forward. The wood whispered against the floor, sliding easily until it lined up perfectly with the edge of the table. He did the same with the next chair and the next, working his way down the row. Then he moved to the other side and did it all again. The sunlight shifted slowly as he worked, stretching across the floor and catching the smooth surfaces of the tables, making them gleam softly in the light. Outside, the branches of tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows flickering across the windows. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, spiralling up by, only to settle back down when he moved on. Mr. Everett continued like this, moving from one table to the next. His hands were steady, his movements slow and careful. Each chair was adjusted just slightly, just enough to make everything perfect. He would pause after each table to look it over, smoothing his hand over the polished wood before moving on. There was no rush. There was never any rush. He had all the time he needed. As the morning passed, the sunlight stretching longer across the floor, casting gentle shadows along the walls. Mr. Everett worked in silence, the only sounds the soft scrape of wood against wood and the occasional creak of the floor beneath his feet. He moved from the east wing to the west wing, arranging and straightening, his hands gliding over the chairs and tables as if they were made of glass. When he reached the last table, a small square one tucked near the back shelves, he paused for a moment. He brushed a speck of dust from its surface, adjusted the 2 chairs that sat opposite one another, and stepped back. He looked it over carefully, running his hand along the edges, checking each corner. He gave a small nod of approval, wiped his hands on a cloth he kept in his pocket, and turned back toward the main hall. The tables were perfectly straight, the chairs neatly aligned. The sunlight poured through the windows, spilling across the wood and making it shine. Everything was in its place. Everything was just right. Mr. Everett walked back to his desk, poured himself a cup of tea, and sat down. His chair creaked softly as he leaned back, the leather cushions sighing gently under his weight. He took a slow sip of his tea, closed his eyes for just a moment, and listened to the silence of the library. Outside, the leaves rustled quietly in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the windows. Inside, the dust motes floated slowly in the sunlight, drifting up and down without a care. The tables and chairs were all where they belonged, perfectly straight, perfectly still. The library was quiet. The tables were arranged, and everything was exactly as it should be. Sunday, preparing the library for a new week. Sunday mornings always began the same way at the endless bookshelf. The sunlight would creep slowly through the tall, arched windows, floors in long, soft lines. Dust motes floated gently in the light, drifting up and down in slow, steady spirals. The library was silent, calm, and perfectly still. Mr. Everett arrived right on time, just as he always did. His shoes made soft tapping sounds as he walked to the heavy oak doors. He turned the brass key with a gentle click, and the door creaked open, the sound spreading out through the library before fading back into silence. He stepped inside, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old paper, polished wood, and just a faint hint of rain, even though the sky outside was clear and bright. Today was Sunday, and that meant it was time to prepare the library for a new week. This was Mr. Everett's favourite day. It was a day of careful attention, slow movements, and quiet reflections. He walked calmly to his desk, his footsteps soft and measured. His desk was just as it always was, neatly arranged, with a green shaded lamp, a stack of clean parchment, and a feather duster hanging on its brass hook. Mr. Everett began by taking out his small wooden broom from the closet behind his desk. It was smooth and polished, its bristles perfectly straight and clean. He ran his hand over the handle, feeling the coolness of the wood under his fingertips. He carried the broom to the front entrance, where the stone path stretched out under the shade of tall trees. Outside, the morning air was crisp and cool. The leaves from the trees had drifted gently onto the stone path, collecting in small, scattered piles. They were red and gold, dry and thin, and they crunched softly under his feet as he walked. Mr. Everett placed the broom carefully on the first stone, held it firmly in his hands, and began to sweep. His movements were slow and fast, even. The bristles brushed against the stone with a soft whispering sound, gathering the leaves into neat little piles. He moved from one stone to the next, one slow sweep at a time, back and forth, back and forth, the leaves sliding gently across, the path collecting neatly along the edges. When he reached the end of the path, he stepped back and looked it over. The stones were clear and clean, stretching out in a smooth, unbroken line from the entrance to the towering oak doors. He nodded once, satisfied, and swept the small piles of leaves into a wooden basket he kept just by the door. Next, he moved back inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The library was still and silent, the morning light stretching longer across the floor. Mr. Everett picked up the feather duster from its hook, brushing his hand over the soft plumes before walking to the front desk. He began to dust the countertops, moving the feathers in slow, sweeping circles. The dust rose in tiny clouds, catching the light before drifting back down, lighter and softer than before. He moved to the reading tables next, dusting the edges, the legs, and the smooth surfaces with the same gentle rhythm. Back and forth, each movement steady his way from table to table, polishing the corners, brushing away even the finest specks of dust, until everything gleamed softly in the sunlight. When the tables were done, he moved to the chairs, straightening them as he dusted, lining them up just so, making sure each one was perfectly even with its neighbour. His hands moved calmly, never rushing, never missing a single detail. He would step back now and then, look everything over, and nod slowly before moving on. Once everything was dusted and arranged, Mr. Everett reached into the small drawer of his desk and pulled out a stack of bookmarks. They were pressed and neat, each one decorated with soft golden tassels. He walked slowly through the library, placing a single bookmark at the edge of each reading table. He set them down gently, smoothing out the edges, making sure each one was perfectly aligned. The library was quiet and still. The sunlight stretched out across the polished floors, glinting off the edges of the shelves, catching on the corners of the tables. Everything was in its place. Everything was just right. Mr. Everett stepped back to his desk, hung the feather duster back on its hook, and poured himself a cup of tea. His chair creaked softly as he sat down, the cushion sighing gently beneath his weight. He leaned back, took a slow sip of his tea, and closed his eyes for just a moment. The library was ready. The tables were straightened, the chairs were lined up, the bookmarks were set out perfectly. Outside, the leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and the shadows flickered gently across the windows. Inside, the dust motes floated in slow spirals, catching the light before settling back down again. Everything was quiet, everything was still, and everything was exactly as it should be. Chapter 2. The Changing of Seasons. The seasons at the endless bookshelf moved with a gentle, steady rhythm. Outside the tall, arched windows, the trees would sway with each passing breeze, their leaves shifting colour and falling slowly to the ground when the time was right. The sunlight would grow softer in autumn, sharper in winter, fresher in spring, and warmer in summer. Inside, the library remained still and constant, a quiet world untouched by the hurry of time. But Mr. Everett knew the seasons well. He watched them pass each year, one after the other, each one bringing its own small changes to the library and its surroundings. His routine stayed the same, calm and steady. But the light would change, the air would shift, and the view from the windows would become something new. Autumn, the gathering of leaves. Autumn came gently to the endless bookshelf. The air grew a little crisper, and the sunlight took on a softer golden hue. Outside the windows, the leaves on the great oak trees turned shades of red, orange, and yellow. They clung to their branches for a while, rustling softly whenever the wind blew through. always did. His shoes would make the same soft tapping sounds as he walked across the polished floor, his footsteps slow and measured. He would unlock the heavy oak doors with a soft click, and they would creak open, the sound spreading out through the library before fading back into the stillness. On autumn mornings, there would always be a light scattering of leaves across the stone path outside. They were dry and thin, their colours bright and warm. Some were curled at the edges, while others lay flat and smooth, perfectly pressed against the cool stones. Mr. Everett would open the closet behind his desk, take out his wooden broom, and carry it outside. He started at the top of the path, where the stones were wide and smooth, leading up to the entrance of the library. His broom swept softly, the bristles whispering against the stone, gathering the leaves into small, neat piles. He moved slowly, one step at a time, brushing the leaves back and forth, until they were collected along the edges of the path. The breeze would sometimes pick up while he worked, sending a few leaves tumbling back across the stones. Mr. Everett never hurried. He would simply walk back to where they had landed, sweep them up again, and place them back in their piles. He did this quietly and calmly, his movements steady and unhurried. When the path was clear, Mr. Everett would collect the leaves in a large wooden basket. He held it by its handles, carrying it carefully to the side of the library, where the leaves would be left to settle back into the earth. He would watch them for a moment, the way they rested one on top of the other, perfectly still. Then he would nod, brush his hands off, and return to the library. Inside, the sunlight would stretch across the floor in long, soft lines. Dust motes would float in the light, drifting up and down like tiny leaves caught in their own gentle breeze. Mr. Everett would take his feather duster from its hook, dust the shelves, and polish the reading tables, just as he always did. Outside, the leaves would drift down from the branches, a few at a time, settling softly onto the stone path, waiting for the next morning when he would come and sweep them away again. Winter, the soft dusting of snow. Winter came quietly to the endless bookshelf. The air grew colder, and the sunlight grew thin and pale, stretching out across the floor in long, cool lines. Outside the windows, the great oak trees stood bare and still, their branches dark and smooth against the soft grey sky. Every so often, the first flakes of snow would begin to fall, drifting down in slow, delicate spirals, settling gently on the stone path outside. Mr. Everett would arrive, just as he always did, his coat buttoned neatly and his scarf wrapped snugly around his neck. He would unlock the doors, step inside, and take a deep breath of the cool, still air. His breath would linger for just a moment, a soft cloud of mist, before disappearing back into the quiet. On snowy mornings, there would always be a light dusting of snow out a wooden-handled snow shovel and carry it outside. The shovel was light and smooth, its blade polished and sharp, though it had no dents or scratches. He would begin at the top of the path, placing the blade carefully against the first stone. His hands gripped the handle firmly, and he would push the snow forward in long, smooth strokes. The snow slid easily off the stone, piling up neatly along the edges. He moved steadily, one stone at a time, each push leaving a clean, clear path behind him. If more snow fell as he worked, he would simply sweep it up again, pushing it to the sides with the same calm, unhurried movements. There was always enough time. There was no need to rush. He moved down the path slowly, brushing away the snow until each stone was perfectly clear. When he was finished, he would step back, look it over, and nod with quiet satisfaction. The path was clean and clear, stretching out in a smooth line. From the entrance of the library to the tall iron gate at the edge of the garden, everything was in its place. Everything was just right. Spring, the gentle rains. Spring came slowly to the endless bookshelf. The sunlight grew warmer, stretching out across the polished wooden floors in long, soft patterns. Outside the tall, arched windows, the trees began to sprout tiny green leaves, bright and delicate, shimmering with the promise of new life. Birds would sometimes perch on the branches, their feathers ruffling gently in the breeze, singing soft, distant songs that barely reached the quiet stillness of the library. Mr. Everett arrived right on time, just as he always did. His shoes made soft tapping sounds as he walked across the polished floors, his footsteps slow and even. He unlocked the heavy oak doors with a soft click, and they creaked open, the sound drifting through the library before fading back into silence. He stepped inside, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just a faint hint of rain, even when the sky outside was clear. Spring was always marked by gentle rains. They would begin softly in the early morning, a light tapping against the tall windows, slow and steady. Mr. Everett would listen as he worked, the sound blending into the quiet rhythm of his routines. It was a soft, comforting sound, like fingertips tapping gently on glass. On rainy mornings, small droplets would slide down the windows, leaving thin, winding trails behind. Mr. Everett would wait for the rain to stop before he began his work outside. When the clouds finally cleared, he would open the closet behind his desk and take out a clean, folded cloth. It was soft and white, perfectly pressed, with not a single wrinkle. He would carry it carefully to the windows, holding it in both hands. He began with the first window in the east wing, where the sunlight touched the glass as it broke through the clouds. Mr. Everett unfolded the cloth, ran his fingers over its edges, and pressed it gently to the window pane. His hand moved in slow, smooth circles, wiping away the faint trails of raindrops. The cloth whispered softly against the glass, until the surface was perfectly clear. He moved from window to window, always in the same order, always with the same gentle rhythm. His hand moved back and forth, the cloth sliding over the glass in soft, even strokes. Outside, the leaves glistened with droplets of water, sparkling just a little when the sunlight touched them. The rain had stopped, but the earth smelled fresh and cool, and the soft scent of rain lingered in the air. When the last window was done, Mr. Everett stepped back, folded the cloth neatly, and carried it back to the closet. He placed it on the top shelf, perfectly aligned with the others, and closed the door with a quiet click. He would pause for a moment, looking out the window, watching the tiny beads of water still clinging to the leaves before they finally slid off, landing quietly on the earth below. The library was still and silent, the windows clean and clear, and the soft scent of spring drifted in with the breeze. Everything was exactly as it should be. Summer, the warm light. Summer came slowly to the endless bookshelf. The days grew longer, and the sunlight poured through the tall windows in golden waves, stretching out across the wooden floors and filling the library with soft warmth. Outside, the trees were full and green, their branches heavy with leaves that rustled gently in the breeze. The light was bright and warm, casting long beams across the reading tables and catching on the corners of the shelves. Mr. Everett arrived right on time, just as he always did. His shoes made soft tapping sounds as he walked to the heavy oak doors. He turned the brass key with a soft click, and the doors creaked open, the sound spreading out through the library before fading back into stillness. He stepped inside, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like old paper and polished wood, with just the faintest hint of summer sunlight. Summer mornings were bright and peaceful. The sunlight would stretch across the rows of books, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. They spiraled up and down, drifting in slow circles, shimmering softly in the light. Mr. Everett would watch them for a moment before walking to his desk and beginning his work. During the summer, he would open the windows just a little, just enough to let the warm breeze drift inside. It would swirl around the room, rustling the pages of open books, carrying the soft scent of blooming flowers from the gardens outside. He would sit at his desk with a cup of tea, watching the curtains flutter gently, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Mr. Everett would sometimes take a slow walk through the rows of books, running his hand along the shelves, feeling the smoothness of the spines. He would look up at the light filtering through the windows, dust motes floating like tiny stars, and listen to the soft rustle of the leaves outside. The breeze would drift in, carrying with it the warmth of the sun and the scent of wildflowers. He would open the great doors for a while, letting the sunlight spill in, filling the entrance with golden light. Sometimes a stray leaf would drift inside, sliding softly across the floor before coming to rest near the edge of a reading table. Mr. Everett would pick it up, examine it for a moment, and place it gently back outside, watching it float down the stone path until it disappeared around the corner. Inside, the library remained cool and still. The light stretched long and thin across the floor, touching the shelves and making the polished wood shine. The windows were open. The air was warm, and everything was exactly as it should be. Chapter 3: The Visitors Who Never Stay. The visitors at the endless bookshelf were rare and quiet. They came softly, their footsteps muffled by the thick wooden floors, their voices hushed by the stillness that filled the library. Mr. Everett always knew when one arrived. He could hear the soft creak of the oak doors as they opened, the gentle rush of air as the visitor stepped inside, and the quiet click as the doors closed once again. They never stayed long. They would wander slowly through the rows of towering shelves, their eyes tracing the spines of the countless books that lined the walls. Some would brush their fingers lightly along the edges of the shelves, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the soft dust that clung to their fingertips. Others would pause in front of the tall arch windows, their eyes drifting out to the gardens beyond, watching the leaves sway gently in the breeze. Mr. Everett always greeted them with a small nod, a gentle acknowledgement of their presence. He never spoke, and neither did they. Words felt unnecessary in the stillness of the library. There was just the soft whisper of footsteps, the faint rustle of turning pages, and the gentle creak of chairs as they settled themselves at one of the polished wooden tables. The visitors would sometimes bring a book to a table, opening it slowly, hands moving carefully as if afraid to disturb the silence. They would turn the pages gently, their eyes moving slowly across the words. Some would read for a few moments, others for a few hours, but always in the same calm, unhurried way. Mr. Everett would watch them from behind his desk, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He liked the way they moved, soft and slow, never rushing, never disturbing the stillness. He would sometimes take a short walk through the shelves while they read, dusting off a stray bit of dust, or straightening a chair that had been moved just a little out of place. He did it quietly, his footsteps barely a whisper against the polished floors. When the visitors left, they always did so quietly. They would close their books carefully, smoothing out the pages before setting them back on the shelves. Sometimes they would pause for a moment, running their hands along the spines, brushing away a bit of dust before stepping back. With soft footsteps, they would make their way back to the entrance. Mr. Everett would always be waiting by the desk, his hands folded neatly, his eyes calm and patient. He would nod again as they passed, a small gesture of farewell. The visitors would nod back, sometimes with a gentle smile, sometimes with nothing more than a soft glance. The heavy oak doors would open with a quiet creak, and they would step outside, letting the door close gently behind them. It would click shut, the sound echoing briefly before fading back into silence. And then it would be still again, just the sunlight drifting through the windows, the dust motes floating lazily in the air, and the soft hum of the library settling back into its familiar rhythm. Mr. Everett would wait for a moment, listening to the quiet, feeling the air grow still. Then he would rise from his chair, walk to the reading tables, and begin his work again. He would straighten the chairs, smooth out the edges of the tables, and dust the surfaces carefully. If a book had been left just slightly out of place, he would pick it up, brush off its cover, and carry it back to its proper spot on the shelf. His hands were gentle and steady, his movements calm and unhurried. He would run his fingers along the row of books, feeling the smoothness of the leather, the tiny ridges where the titles were pressed into the spines. He would make sure each one was perfectly straight, perfectly aligned with the others. When everything was back in order, he would step back, take a slow, deep breath, and look around the room. The library would be still and silent once again. The sunlight would stretch across the floor, catching the edges of the shelves and making the polished wood gleam. The dust motes would float softly in the air, swirling gently before settling back down. Everything would be just as it had been before. Everything would be just right. Sometimes days would pass without a visitor. The library would be quiet and still, just the sound of Mr. Everett's soft footsteps and the gentle whisper of his feather duster brushing along the shelves. He would work calmly and patiently, tending to each task with the same steady rhythm, never rushing, never pausing. When a visitor did arrive, it was never expected and never announced. The doors would simply open and they would step inside, their footsteps soft and light. Mr. Everett would nod. They would nod back, and the stillness of the library would remain unbroken. They would walk the same rows, run their fingers along the same spines, and sometimes take a seat at one of the reading tables. They would read quietly, turning the pages slowly, their hands gentle on the corners of the paper. When they were done, they would place the book back on the shelf, nod to Mr. Everett, and leave just as softly as they had come. And then the silence would return, deep and calm, stretching out through the rows of books, filling the space with its soft, quiet breath. Chapter 4. The Whisper of Time. Time moved gently at the endless bookshelf. The days slipped quietly from one into the next, each one just like the one before. The sunlight would filter through the tall, arched windows, stretching across the Wooden floors in long, steady lines. Dust motes would drift in slow spirals, floating up and down, catching the light before settling softly back down again. Mr. Everett moved through the library with the same calm, unhurried steps. His shoes tapped softly against the polished floors. His hands moved carefully over the spines of books. His eyes drifted slowly across the rows and rows of neatly ordered shelves. His routine never changed. Not by much. Not in any way that he could truly feel. But every so often there were small signs of time passing. Tiny, gentle whispers that hinted that the days had stretched on, one after the other, moving forward even if the library itself seemed untouched. The slightly moved bookmark. One morning, as Mr. Everett began his usual dusting of the east wing, he noticed something different. It was small, so small that it almost escaped his attention. But Mr. Everett was a careful man, and he noticed the small things. A bookmark pressed neatly between the pages of an old leather-bound book had moved. It was only a few inches, perhaps less, but it was different than it had been before. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the top of the ladder, and he looked at it quietly. The bookmark was red, with a thin golden tassel that dangled from the end. It had been tucked neatly into the centre of the book the last time he had dusted this shelf, but now it was closer to the beginning, just a few chapters in. He looked around the room, though he knew it would be empty. It almost always was. The dust motes floated gently in the sunlight, drifting up and down with no hurry at all. Thus, shelves stood still and patient, stretching up to the high ceiling, each row perfectly aligned. Mr. Everett climbed the last step of the ladder, reached out his hand, and adjusted the bookmark back to where it had been. He brushed his fingers along the spine, feeling the soft texture of the leather, smoothing away the faint layer of dust that had collected there. He stepped back, nodded once, and climbed back down the ladder. The library was silent. The sunlight continued to stretch across the floor, catching the edges of the shelves, reflecting off the polished wood. Everything was just as it had been before. Everything was back in its place. The slightly crooked chair. A few weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Mr. Everett was reorganising the periodicals. He had just finished straightening the stack of newsletters from 1925 when he turned to move to the next shelf. That's when he saw it. One of the wooden chairs near the reading table was just slightly out of place. It wasn't much, just an inch or so, but it was different. The back legs weren't perfectly aligned with the edges of the table, and the seat was turned just a bit to the left. Mr. Everett paused, setting down the stack of periodicals, and walked over slowly. He placed his hand gently on the back of the chair, running fingers over the smooth wood. He straightened it carefully, moving it inch by inch, until it was exactly as it should be. He stepped back, looked it over, and nodded. Everything was back in place. Everything was just right. He stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. Outside, the leaves rustled gently in the breeze, their shadows flickering across the tall windows. Inside, the dust motes floated in soft spirals, catching the sunlight before settling back down. Mr. Everett watched them for a moment, his hands folded neatly behind his back, and then he turned and returned to his work. The Wandering Book. Sometimes Mr. Everett would find a book that had moved just slightly. It was never a big shift, just a small change. A book that had been perfectly aligned with the others would sometimes sit a little forward, its spine just a touch out of line, or sometimes one would be leaning slightly to the left, resting against its neighbour instead of standing perfectly straight. Whenever he found one, Mr. Everett would pause, dust off its cover, and slide it back into place. He would run his hand along the row, feeling the spines brush against his fingertips, making sure everything was smooth and even. He liked the feeling of it, the gentle correction, the soft return to order. He would step back, admire the way the books were, lined up neatly, and nod slowly. Everything would be just as it should be. The library would be still. The dust motes would continue to float in their slow, gentle spirals, and the sunlight would stretch across the floor in long, steady lines. The passing of time. Time moved gently in the endless bookshelf. Days drifted into weeks. Weeks drifted into months. And still the routines went on, calm and unchanging. Mr. Everett would move through the rows of shelves, dusting, straightening, cataloguing, and polishing, just as he always did. Outside, the seasons would come and go. The leaves would fall, the snow would gather, the rains would sweep in, and the sunlight would warm the stones. And every so often, there would be a small whisper of change, a bookmark slightly out of place, a chair just a bit crooked, a book that leaned just a little too far. Mr. Everett would always notice, always fix it, always make it just right, and the library would continue its quiet rhythm, stretching on and on, endless and serene. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Rooms. The library stretched on forever, its rows of towering shelves lined with books upon books, each one neatly dusted and perfectly aligned. The sunlight drifted through the tall, arched windows, casting long, soft beams across the polished wooden floors. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, spiraling up and down like tiny stars, drifting through still water. Everything was just as it always was. But on a quiet Thursday morning, something changed. Anne was small the last shelf, there was a door. It was wooden, just like the rest of the library, but it was different. The edges were worn and smooth. The handle was brass, polished and bright. Mr. Everett stared at it for a long moment, his feather duster still in his hand, resting against the books. He didn't remember the door. He didn't remember it ever being there before. But there it was, as clear as anything, standing quietly at the edge of the shelf. He stepped forward, his footsteps soft and even, and reached out his hand. His fingers brushed the smooth brass handle, and it was cool beneath his touch. Mr. Everett paused, took a slow, deep breath, and turned the handle. It clicked softly, and the door swung inward without a sound. Inside was a small room, perfectly still and perfectly quiet. Shelves lined the walls, stretching up to the ceiling, filled with books he had never seen before. They were thick with dust, their spines worn and faded, their covers marked with age. The sunlight from the main hall spilled in through the open door, casting a soft glow over the shelves. Dust floated gently in the air, shimmering in the light, settling back down in soft whispers. Mr. Everett stepped inside, his shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. The room was cool and calm, untouched by time. His hand drifted over the nearest shelf, his fingertips brushing away a thin layer of dust, revealing the title of the first book. It was written in gold leaf, almost completely faded, but he could still make it out. He read the title quietly to himself, his voice soft and steady. The Library of Quiet Places. Mr. Everett nodded slowly, his hand still resting on the book. He looked around the room, taking in the rows and rows of forgotten books, each one neatly placed, waiting patiently for someone to find them. He took a deep breath, the smell of old paper and polished wood filling his lungs, and he felt something soft and warm settle over him, something like peace. A new part of the routine. From that day forward, Mr. Everett added the room to his routine. Every Monday he dusted the shelves, making sure each book was clean and neat, brushing away the layers of time that had settled there. His feather duster moved slowly along the spines, just as it did in the main hall, his movements steady and calm. Every Tuesday he would organise the shelves, straightening the books, aligning them perfectly. He would run his hands along the edges, feeling the softness of the leather, the faint ridges of the embossed titles. If he found a book slightly out of place, he would adjust it gently, smoothing out its cover, brushing away any stray bits of dust. Every Wednesday he would polish the small wooden tables tucked away in the corners of the room. His cloth moved in slow, even circles, spreading a thin layer of beeswax over the surface until it shone softly in the light. He would stand back, admire his work, and nod with quiet satisfaction. Every Thursday he would catalogue the books, would read each title aloud, just as he always did, his voice blending with the silence of the library. Every Friday, he would clean the single window at the back of the room. It was smaller than the others, but the light that shone through was just as bright, just as warm. He would wipe the glass in slow, even strokes, his hand moving back and forth, until it was perfectly clear. On Saturday, he would straighten the chairs and tables, making sure everything was just right. And on Sunday, he would sweep the path outside, watching the leaves gather in neat piles, listening to the soft rustle as they settled back to the ground. The library that never ends. Time drifted by, slow and gentle, just as it always had. The seasons came and went. The sunlight grew warm, then cool, then warm again. Mr. Everett continued his work, day after day, week after week, moving through the library with calm, steady steps. And the room remained just as he had found it, still and quiet, filled with forgotten books, waiting patiently for his careful hands. The sunlight spilled in through the windows, stretching across the floor, catching the edges of the shelves, making the dust motes float and sparkle in the light. Everything was quiet, everything was still, and everything was exactly as it should be. The end of the story, and that is the end of our story. The endless bookshelf continues on, stretching out into the quiet stillness, filled with rows and rows of books, polished tables and clean windows. Mr. Everett walks its halls each day, dusting and straightening, polishing and organising, just as he always has. The sunlight drifts through the tall, arched windows. The dust motes float in slow spirals, and everything remains just right. Time whispers softly through the shelves, but nothing ever truly changes. Everything is calm, everything is peaceful, and everything is just